So let's have a quick review of where we are in this fairy tale. So looking at an archetype as a fractal, that's a complexity theory term, where you have the same pattern across many levels, personal, family, cultural. We have a story of wealth in the masculine yang realm at the expense of the feminine yin realm to the degree that the feminine gets sick and dies. The problem gets transferred to the next generation of the feminine in the form of Cinderella, who initially tries to survive with a spiritualized mother watching over her to be pious and good, cutting Cinderella off from the body and emotions. So that collapses into a showy persona, the beautiful stepsisters, fitting into the old yang world, which covers and hides a dead feminine, the negative mother, with its deprecatory messages, the pure negredo phase of hopeless Cinderella in the ashes. When the trial phase of the archetypal pattern in the I Ching of spring, growth, harvest, and trial has been fully endured, an archetypal shift occurs with a movement into the spring phase with a synchronistic event occurring, where the outer mirrors the inner, the tree branch that knocked off the father's hat, a symbol of his position and power in the psyche. Synchronistic events occur in the archetypal situations, and this is the archetype of a shift from one phase to another. The tree growing from the branch signaled the emergence of a new form of feminine, literally growing out of the breakdown of the old feminine to release its energies to reformulate it from the ground of nature up, from Lao Tzu's mother, the source, what the Tao points to. So the growing tree as an emerging self-symbol for the new feminine is accompanied by Cinderella being able to make wishes and to imagine and to have her wishes satisfied in her imagination. The bird in the tree throwing down to her whatever she wishes for. The crack in the personality structure is how the light gets in. The connection to Lao Tzu's source with depression, anxiety, etc., being the precursors for those coming into therapy. It's important to realize other avenues to the source, like deep meditation and deliberate challenges to the psyche soma during a vision quest. This is a painting from one of my favorite artists, Susan Boulay. So Jung saw dreams as, quote, unvarnished products of nature, end of quote. And Jungian analyst James Hillman called dreams zoological cathedrals. In other words, sacred spaces for nature, nature experienced in a sacred manner. Jung said, quote, we are in nature and think exactly like nature, end of quote. I see our dreams as emerging from the same natural source as the answers from the I Ching. In a lecture I gave at the Sandplay Conference in China in November and December of 2022, I illustrated a profound connection between dreams and the I Ching with the significant appearance of hexagrams in the dream of a Western male professor. If I were working with a person with a Cinderella complex, there would probably be several points in the analysis where I might suggest asking a question of the I Ching about how to relate to a mother or a sister that were embodying Cinderella's stepsisters and stepmother. So getting meaningful answers is what I see as the ultimate form of mirroring that I illustrated with the baby and the mother in the blank face experiment. It's like the universe sees you in your particular state. It's like being seen mirrored by Chinese sages or a dear uncle who loves you. This is, I think, my most amazing experience as a scientist to be able to get meaningful answers from the I Ching. And in terms of psychoanalytic theory and psychological theory, this is the best way I can explain it. It's like the universe mirrors you, the universe sees you at a very deep level. I can't think of anything more profound than that. With reference to this image here, I certainly don't feel like I'm being looked at by a blank face from the universe. So remember that what we are dealing with in this fairy tale is expressed in the abstract level in the I Ching as an old yang line. That's the number 9 there at the bottom, as a changing line in an old king in alchemy, changing into a young yin line, and 8 as a young feminine, presented as Cinderella in this fairy tale. Her eventual marriage to the young king, a 7 as the young yang, will shape his masculine energy as he relates to a new form of feminine energy. I find the I Ching so helpful in being able to think at these kind of fundamental archetypal levels. So one thing I so admire about China is that one of the oldest civilizations on the planet has an unbroken link back to shamanism through your Chinese characters for writing and through divinatory practices like asking for guidance from the I Ching, one of the oldest books on the planet. As I mentioned before, Jung saw fairy tales as complementing Christianity, the dominant spiritual form in the West, for what is left out and even denigrated, things like animals and nature, and the pagans and witches, those who worked with the spirits in nature for healing and guidance. That would be related to Lao Tzu's mother, source, and origin, as far as I can understand it.
那我非常钦佩中国的一点呢，是作为地球上最古老的文明之一，中国通过汉字书写和占卜习俗，与萨满教有着不间断的一种联系。那我们知道哈，这个占卜，中国古代就是用这种易经来进行作为一种指引。
So I gave a talk in December of 23 at the 10th International Conference on Analytical Psychology and Chinese Culture on Jung and the Environment, and was deeply struck on the post-conference tour visit to Mount Tai, a mountain I never heard of, with a sense that many Chinese may still have a sense of the sacred in the environment, something we do not have here in the United States. It's hard to express how deeply moved I was by that trip to Mount Tai, and it was just amazing for me to think of just a lack of a sacred sense about the environment that we have here in the United States. We only associate that with the Native American populations. So we're now ready for the next stage of development, and another happening occurs. So read this as a movement from the self. So it happened, however, that the king gave orders for a festival, which was to last 3 days, and by which all the beautiful young women in the country were invited, in order that his son might choose a bride. When the 2 stepsisters heard that they too were to appear among the number, they were delighted, called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair for us, brush our shoes, and fasten our buckles, for we are going to the wedding at the king's palace." Cinderella obeyed, but wept, because she would like to have gone with them to the dance, and begged her stepmother to allow her to do so. "You go, Cinderella," said she, "covered in dust and dirt as you are, and would go to the festival? You have no clothes and shoes, and yet would dance?" As, however, Cinderella went on asking, the stepmother said at last, "I have emptied a dish of lentils into the ashes for you. If you pick them out again, in 2 hours you shall go with us." The maiden went through the back door into the garden and called, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick the good ones into the pot, the bad ones into the crop." So notice that the masculine yang energy has moved into another dimension, beyond the personal, Cinderella's father, into the archetypal domain of the king archetype. In this case, the old king, because a generational change is coming. The king to be, the prince, needs a mate. This is expressed in the mathematics of complexity theory, where additional input into a system increases the tension in the system, and it morphs into a higher and more complex level after undergoing a phase shift. For example, when the tension in our personal father complex gets too great, it morphs into the mythological archetypal domain as an issue with a king, as we can see in our big dreams. So in Cinderella, we have moved beyond a generic festival to a very focused issue, a festival to find a feminine match for the next generation, a new iteration of male-female relationships of yin and yang energy. Note that no queen is mentioned. It will be a rerun of the old story if one of Cinderella's sisters gets chosen by the prince, right? But new feminine energy has been developing in Cinderella. If there is a strong development in the feminine realm, it will change the masculine-feminine dynamics in the new kingdom, filling the vacuum left by the absent queen. So if there's a development in one area, it's going to posit a development in its complement. If the complement doesn't develop, it's going to lead to a repression or suppression of the new development in the first area. And you see this in therapy. If one person goes into therapy, and let's say they start undergoing some profound change, it's going to force a development with their partner. So there can be some danger if the partner doesn't go into analysis. And my analyst in Zurich warned me about that very issue. And this is a very immediate phenomena for me. I started working with a woman. She had a very profound dream very early in the analysis. And as we worked it, we've been working on it for 2 sessions now. And what she said toward the end of our last session is she's wonders what effect that's going to have on her marriage for her to be working at this deep level. And by the way, we've been able to plug one of her images in her dreams to an early image in the Cinderella myth. That makes a profound influence on an analysand if they can see what kind of an archetypal story they are living out. And when you see Cinderella as your archetype, you can see that there's going to be a lot of emotional difficulty to deal with. So back to our tale. So the king or chief has long been associated with magic qualities with mana. They incorporate a divine principle on which the entire welfare of the nation depends, both psychic and physical. Kings represent the incarnation or embodiment of a divine principle, its indwelling place, a self-image for a culture. The kings have many aspects of the dragon in the Chinese zodiac. The king represents the dominant values, like a king or ruling image in us, that provides orientation in various aspects of our life. They represent a dominant or collective consciousness that underlines all the political and religious doctrines of a social group. The king also gives a conception of how a man would live his life. He personifies the value systems of that man in that culture. Self symbols age, and the king, as the dominant and most central symbol in the collective consciousness, is fully exposed to the changes and challenges in a culture. Here's another old king image from alchemy. It is easy for the dominant element to lose the irrational contact with the flow of life and the flow of psychic events in the unconscious and become mechanical. The king, like religion, is always threatened by long exposure to consciousness to becoming dead formulas and a system and doctrine empty of meaning and thereby purely an outer form. Power wants to accumulate power, and the adage is power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. In our fairy tale, the rebirth of the king is going to be the prince. So if the king represents the divine spirit incarnate, hexagram 1, the creative logos, collective consciousness, an ideal male model, the queen represents the complementary archetypal feminine, hexagram 2, the receptive, the eros principle of relatedness to the unconscious, the irrational, and the feminine, and the role model for the feminine in a culture. Jung talked about the feminine very much in terms of that which represents the connection to the historical layers of the collective unconscious. So here we have an image of Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned in England around 1600, and the modern Queen Elizabeth, who died in 2022. As the anima of the king, she symbolizes a connection to the deeper levels of the collective unconscious, like I just mentioned, and the limiting realities of space-time in the material realm. The queen represents a dominant image of what a woman is to be in a culture, what the feminine values and even the physical beauty is for that culture at that point in time, and a certain habit or style of living, an arrow style of how people in a society relate to each other. So is it not surprising that only the beautiful women of the kingdom are invited to this mating game? Cinderella's father, as a member of the kingdom and reflecting its dominant values portrayed by the king, has shortchanged the feminine for the shallow beauty of form, hexagram 22, grace, that once upset Confucius when he received this hexagram. It's amazing what you can find on the internet to illustrate lecture points. Note the lower right-hand corner with regard to hexagram 22 depicted here. It says, do not judge based on appearance. The words deceive and superficial appearance. Cinderella's consciousness has taken a quantum leap forward. Her strong desire to go to the celebration, the festival, is an extroverted wish to come out of her bewitched, isolated state. So the stepsister side of the Cinderella complex is ready to go to the ball, the social, prestigious aspect of her, the persona and image size. This would be extracting the gold from her shadow, her showy, extroverted, narcissistic, beautiful sister side. The desire for union is the spirit behind the animus, but the encapsulated ashes side of Cinderella will leave her empty within if she goes to the ball. So the stepsisters are like Cinderella's shadow, if you will, and the gold in the dung, if you will, would be Cinderella being able to show her beautiful side, which she still is in the process of developing, though. So now Cinderella confronts the stepmother for the first time, begs her repeatedly, revealing a growing sense of self and agency. But the negative mother complex is still too strong, and the response is for potentially nourishing food to be thrown back into the ashes. A person in this state can come up with good intentions to act, but the negative undertow undoes that. So sorting the seeds is a motif in fairy tales of an insoluble task, meaning it's beyond one's conscious state to accomplish. Cinderella is given 2 hours to sort out the lentils, 2 being a sign something is coming into consciousness. The 2 motifs is amplified by the birds discriminating between good and bad seeds, consciousness being the ability to discriminate one thing from another. So here we have an image of lentils damaged by a fungal disease with a healthy seed on the lower right side. Seeds are a sign of fruitfulness, potential growth, and perseverance, the ability to stick to things. Cinderella cannot at this point consciously distinguish between her good, life-nourishing, and bad, life-destroying thoughts. She needs unconscious support to do so. The unconscious realm is metaphorically presented as the birds coming in through the back door and from the garden, from nature. Research has shown that the unconscious creatively wrestles with difficult problems in our dreams and can offer novel and insightful solutions. So the metaphor we're following with regard to this image is our bad thoughts are like lentils infected by a fungus. So the pigeon is an interesting bird. It is associated with peace, flight, gentleness, tenderness, and wisdom. The Holy Spirit in the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost Spirit is represented by a dove and seen as a messenger from the above. The Virgin Mary is associated with it, and so is Aphrodite, goddess of love, sex, eros, and sensual beauty. The constellation of a new spirit is a tremendous change in Cinderella's psyche. She is connecting with the archetypal, more spiritualized dimensions of the energies associated with the dove. Like big dreams, this can lay the foundation for a fundamentally different orientation in life, if the dreams can be related to and the energies incarnated into one's life and consciousness. The fact that the pigeons are tame indicate a certain degree of domestication, something closer to human consciousness than completely wild or of nature. The pigeon can be a mean bird as well, as we will see at the end of the tale. So what is very important here is to do what the Hillmanians call stick with the image. If you look at the pigeon, especially a white pigeon, and its behavior, that's the foundation for the images that various cultures have, the images that are generated in various cultures from the pigeon. It'll come out in different ways in different cultures, but you always have to go back to the source and kind of imagine and feel your way into that, and then think about the derivations. In our Western culture, it came out in two very different ways. One is connected with the Virgin Mary and the God and the Holy Spirit, and the other is the Greek pagan sense of Aphrodite as the god of love and sensuality. Two very different images, archetypal images in our Western culture. So I'm describing to you how this archetypal stimulus is coming from a Western viewpoint, and that's the beauty of archetypes. Then you can take this and then see how does it manifest in Chinese culture. One of the most interesting examples for me as a Westerner is in the West, dragons are considered to be very frightening. And in China, like the Year of the Dragon, that's something very powerful and in many respects quite positive. The De Vries Symbol Dictionary tells us that the turtle dove is associated with, quote, affection and love, even representing a man who likes to dance. It is a harbinger of spring, indicating that winter is over and the time for love has come. I just love the coloration and the patterns on the turtle dove. So calling all you birds beneath the sky is about the spiritual archetypal domain that birds represent, a domain of spirits, angels, and supernatural aid. So the story continues. Then two white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at length all the birds beneath the sky came whirling and crowding in and alighted amongst the ashes. And the doves nodded with their heads and began pick, pick, pick. And the others began also pick, 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 and gathered all the good seeds into the dishes. And before half an hour was over, they had already finished, and they flew out again. Then the maiden carried the dishes to the stepmother and was delighted and believed that she may now go with them to the wedding. So Tunis as something becoming conscious is again a motif, this time with two pigeons. And we move from the domesticated, the pigeon, and closer to the consciousness, the number two, to close to humans, turtle doves with no number given, meaning a little more generic. Then a transition to the broadest, most general and archetypal realm of all the birds of the sky. This is important numerical symbolism to track as an analyst. So the kitchen is a place of preparation with the blending and transformation of raw materials into tasty and nurturing food, a place associated with the feminine in its nurturing aspect. So notice the repetition of pick, pick, pick by the birds. When you see an activity in fairy tales and dreams, you must imagine and feel that activity in the body, literally acting it out if possible. We've all seen how birds move about, especially pigeons, with a sort of anxious activity. Bird pecks are very directed, quick and strong. I imagine all the thoughts racing through an anxious mind, the monkey mind, as meditators call it, being quickly sorted through by a host of pecking birds to discriminate between nurturing, I have trouble with that word, and non-nurturing thoughts. This is something Cinderella could not do in her fully depressed state. It is so difficult, but very vitally important, to bring those conscious thoughts into consciousness and sort through them. So the birds sorting through the seeds in the ashes reminds me of Leonard Cohen's enchanting song, Suzanne, about a level 4 anima. She shows you where to look amongst the garbage and the flowers. So it's important to acknowledge that we need help. This is the state of mind one is when praying or when putting a question to the I Ching. It is also the mindset when crying for a vision or for the appearance of a spirit animal during a Sioux Indian vision quest. So next what happens is the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, you have no clothes and you cannot dance, you only be laughed at." And as Cinderella wept at this, the stepmother said, "If you can pick 2 dishes of lentils out of the ashes for me in 1 hour, you shall go with us." And she thought to herself, that she most certainly cannot do. So though Cinderella was crushed by this reaction, she didn't give up. She has tapped into a supportive archetypal source her stepmother cannot imagine. Cinderella shows the persistence and hard work necessary to move towards the goal of union, what we Jungians call the individuation process. The work necessary in hexagram 2 to manifest, embody the inspiration of hexagram 1, in this case, the self. So Cinderella calls the birds back in, and the seeds are sorted out in half an hour, metaphorically indicating that Cinderella can more quickly discriminate, at least at the unconscious level. Her delight was crushed again by the stepmother's response. But the stepmother said, "All this will not help. You cannot go with us. We have no clothes and cannot dance. We should be ashamed of you." On this, she turned her back on Cinderella and hurried away with her 2 proud daughters. So consciousness has been raised, but the internal negative mother is still overpowering. The emphasis on being able to dance is about being in an embodied flow in connection with the animus. Jung called the anima and the animus the archetype of the soul. So consciousness is stuck at this phase. So we go to the next phase when we read that after the family had left for the ball, no one was at home now. Cinderella went to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree and cried, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold throw down on me." Then the bird threw down a gold and silver dress to her and slippers embroidered with silk and silver. She put on the dress with all speed and went to the wedding. So Cinderella has disobeyed her basic pattern, her complex of "I am not allowed, I am worthless," and goes to the good mother place, the tree, and asks for gold and silver. In adolescence, it is an important step to disobey the parent sometimes, but later it is the inner complex that you must disobey. So notice that when Cinderella is alone, after the family leaves, she can tap into her developing self. And her requests for gold and silver and her assertiveness have come a long way from asking only from what knocks off her father's hat, which was a branch from a bush. So earlier, Cinderella, her first wishes after the whatever knocked her father's hat off was that a bird that was in the tree that grew from her mother's grave, she would make wishes and the bird would grant them, but that was all in her imagination. Now, her wishes are being more physically manifest by actually getting a dress in the physical world, if you will. So she's beginning to manifest something in the physical world, or something is coming closer to consciousness and more real. So I love the image of a tree shivering and quivering. It's like the tree as self is so charged and energized and enlivened that it shivers and quivers. This image reminds me a bit of the bunches of bamboo trees we saw when I was hiking with Terrence toward Yangzhou, and the wind was blowing, and I'd never heard anything like this before. You could actually hear some creaking and clicks coming from those trees. It's almost like the trees were kind of alive. So Osper points out the significance of asking for gold and silver instead of jewelry and beautiful dresses. It's like asking that she be seen in the world for her most indestructible self, her true self. The more masculine associations with gold would be striving forward, clarity, powerful standpoint, and persistence through difficult situations. Silver, as Osper points out, is about relatedness, feminine because it relates to its surroundings, the air, which can also tarnish silver. Osper, and I quote, says, "The silver in us is our possibility to react with the world, people, situations, things, to being loved or hated, to be joyful or sad. It is very important to react and to know what to do with these reactions," end of quote. First, notice what your reaction is to a client, for example, then you can decide what to do with that reaction. So gold and silver would symbolize a balance and complementary fit of yin and yang energies, answering the imbalance of those energies in the opening sentence of this fairy tale. The yin-yang symbol is a perfect image for this, with the anima at the heart of the yang and the animus at the heart of the yin. So Cinderella is developing a healthy narcissism and exhibitionism out of the shadow aspects of her stepsisters. Consider Cinderella and the stepsisters like the little people within, as Jung called them, the polarities of a complex. So the stepsisters, if you will, with regard to this image, would be the dark yin, and Cinderella would be the light yang. So if a dress matches one's inner state and feelings, it's a soul dress and an outward show of inward wealth and beauty. Unlike the persona dress and ego wish for the stepsisters that disguises an emptiness and even a cruelty within. So Catherine Osper pointed out that some fairy tales variations on the dress go in the sequence of sun to moon to stars, from a masculine solar attitude to moon feminine side, less clear but more subtle, to a star being a personal mixture of the opposites with one's unique presentation and style. Actors become stars because of the unique characters they become on the big screen. An interesting aspect of that is when you think of movie stars, they have this image that people have of them from the movies. So those are, if they're a star, it's some kind of an archetypal image. But so many actors or famous musicians have had tremendous trouble in their personal lives. There's this big gap between that archetypal star realm and the normal human world with its difficulties in love relationships and everything else. I think this is especially clear, I think I may have mentioned this in an earlier lecture, with people that become famous rock and roll stars. They play, say, in front of thousands of people in a stadium, and the people are singing along with them. So that's the archetypal realm. But so many of these famous musicians have had drug and alcohol problems. So slippers emphasize the feminine aspect of footwear. Silk is associated with beauty and extravagance, and silver underscores the feminine nature of the slippers. The stepsisters had given Cinderella wooden shoes, indicating a heavy, impoverished, ill-fitting, and clumsy way of walking through life. Footwear indicates in what way we are connected to the ground of being, to Mother Earth. So as I mentioned at the opening of lecture 2, you cannot preach love into a person or tell them to value themselves. As a therapist, you can value the client so they can get a sense of their value, and you can help them start listening to themselves when their psyche values them. Cinderella felt valued when the good mother was constellated in her. As I also had mentioned before, notice that this was constellated within her own unconscious by going deeply, by mourning, if you will. As I imagine it, she returned to the source, what Lao talks about the source. And that's one of the unique dimensions of Jungian psychology. We can talk about these archetypal dimensions as being able to generate something at a very fundamental level within our psyches. And an important eco-psychological dimension is that Cinderella did this outside, and it was a tree and birds. So Mother Nature, if you will, as something that is healing, and to be in it can help constellate this good mother within oneself. So next we read her stepsisters and stepmother, however, did not know her and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. They never once thought of Cinderella and believed that she was sitting at home in the dirt picking lentils out of the ashes. So the step family is so trapped in their complex, they can't see their inner worth. So, wow, look what happens next. The prince approached her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. He would dance with no other maiden and never let loose of her hand. And if anyone else came to invite, he said, "This is my partner." So in one variant of the fairy tale, Cinderella could only look through a window, meaning her ego needed to be strengthened before fully engaging the animus. So often in fairy tales, a positive anima comes only after a relationship with a positive mother. If the negative mother complex is still strong, the animus will often be negative, like a robber. Cinderella at the ball is in touch with the value and soul beauty in herself and narcissistically displays it to the world. She is alive and in touch with the world, relating to it, the silver. This can be with a member of the opposite sex or a friend, a dialogue, walking together, emailing others, affective attunement, etc. Those are ideas that I got from Osper, those important thoughts. You are really relating when you dance. The dance is being in the dance of life, expressive, in the flow and rhythm, movement and letting go to appetites as well. The dance close to a member of the opposite sex that one is attracted to implies body heat, the sensuality of the power of touch and skin-to-skin contact, and pheromones, external hormones emitted by both sexes. So Cinderella, for the first time, is being mirrored by a human, seen for the inner beauty she has been developing since in touch with herself, and seen big time by a handsome prince looking for a bride. So in a man, this can be about a relationship with the feminine side and vice versa for a woman. It can be about the relationship between head and heart, feelings and thoughts, an inner dance with our thoughts, or an outer relationship with a person. It is important to have a felt reality behind the thoughts when we are dealing with things that matter. Psychological theory, for example, is empty if a therapist can't fill it out with their own life experience. So Cinderella at the ball is a true albedo movement in alchemy, the first light showing forth from the darkness of the negredo. It's an inflationary moment. An example is a young woman strongly attracted to a young man who asked her out. All the thoughts she has about the young man before she actually goes out with him would be her inflated animus fantasies, the albedo phase of a relationship. Why don't we open it up for some questions and some discussion?
The first question is about the shoes. In China, in the traditional society, the women's feet are bonded. We have the foot bonding culture in the past. And here the question, has the Cinderella's shoe has anything to do with the foot bonding?
That's a very interesting question. I sent you that article where it was mentioned what the variations of this fairy tale were through the years, and the oldest story of Cinderella actually comes from China, and it was mentioned, I think, in that article that foot binding was a part of, I think it was what they did for the queens or the court in Chinese culture. And it's interesting that in all the variations of Cinderella, that shoe fitting at the very end is something that you find throughout the world. But it might go back in some ways to the foot binding in ancient China.
It happened in other cultures as well, right? You mean?
I don't know if foot binding happened in other cultures, but because it was maybe such an unusual motif of an unusual thing in Chinese culture, maybe that's why that motif got started, if you will. I think it'll be interesting for you to ask about what that implied about the feminine in the ancient courts in Chinese. Why did they bind the feet? Did that mean that it made the women look more dainty or something? And then think about that with regard to the most fundamental level that we're developing in this fairy tale, that we're talking about the development of a new type of feminine energy, an emerging source of feminine energy, more connected to nature. And then one would ask oneself, is binding one's feet, is that kind of going against nature in some way just to look beautiful? But wait a minute, the feet are extremely important for us to be able to get around, to walk and so on. So just considering that issue of foot binding in terms of the feminine in relationship to that concept of the feminine in ancient Chinese culture, and then where you are today with that, that would be an interesting comparison. Also keep that issue in mind when we get toward the end of the tale, where the mother cuts off the toe of one of the daughters so she can fit into the shoe. And for the second daughter, she cuts off part of the heel. And the mother says, well, you won't need your big toe or you won't need your heel when you become queen.
Okay, Jungian further comment that in the Chinese version of the Cinderella, and the shoe is the golden one. And also in China, we have an image that is a 3-inch golden lotus, literally. Do you know that?
A what did you say? The last bit?
3-inch golden lotus. It's
3-inch
as
golden
small
lotus.
as, yeah, lotus.
Yes. Wow.
Do you have any comment on that?
No, but I've seen some pictures of those shoes. I could not believe how tiny they were.
The comment, her comment is about cutting off part of the foot you just mentioned. It may represent cutting off the capacity to be grounded.
Oh yeah, no, I'll go into that, amplify that when we get to that part of the tale. I just wanted to kind of look ahead because it relates to this issue about foot binding.
对，我们
That's
剧透了
definitely
一
what it
点。
is. It's about the grounding, but the more important motif is the degree to which when we get to that point, the degree to which the old feminine that's fitting into that culture of the excessive yang, the extent that it's ready to go to punish itself, to torture itself, to fit into the mold of what what they perceive to be the male expectations for the female in that culture, even though it's brutalizing to their own bodies, to their own psyches. Where we really see it here in America are the many young women who starve themselves, and a lot of anorexia develops it from that because they have the image, they think there's the cultural image of this thin woman. And if your body is not naturally thin, if you will, if you're what's a stockier person and so on, that's where a lot of that type of torture comes in American culture.
There's a comment, and maybe she want to confirm with you about it. And can we say that only the Cinderella is has to be desperate enough that she can go back to her positive energy? She must be so depressed, so desperate. Then there is a possibility that she can reconnect with her positive energies.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's that's what I was trying to describe before, that in therapy, you see it where the person goes through the false bottoms, if you will. They think they're at the root of their problems, and what do you know, there's some more false bottoms. And it's at that point where you just kind of almost like give up. So the ego and all of its structures like fall apart. That's kind of how I imagine uh, Cinderella under the aegis, if you will, of her mother, that whole way of being in the world, that feminine way of being in the world, took a long time for all those forms to die off. And when all that stuff dies off, then the way I imagine it is you're close to that source, that generative energy that Lao Tzu talks about. So for that generative energy to come through a female, that's where you get these more feminine type, yin type manifestations, if you will. That's why it's such an important concept, especially such an important Jungian concept. That's why I mentioned two other ways, kind of more positive ways of getting to that same depth. And in therapy, almost always it comes in somebody really depressed or anxious or some serious psychological issue. But a positive way and a model that I've been intrigued by is the Native American Vision Quest, where for 4 days and nights you're without food and water out there on the Great Plains. And like my dear friend Fred said, you feel like you're gonna die, you know? So it's like there's no ego control, there's no conscious control, like your body is just taking over. But it's in a sacred container that you establish and people are praying for. So you're hoping for, you're praying for, but you can't count on getting a sense of what your essence is from that. And of course, the other way that's more commonly mentioned is like deep meditation, where you can go beneath all the forms and structures, including the most powerful one, the archetypal forms, to get to that source. So those are 3 ways: Cinderella way, Vision Quest way, meditation. There's
Right.
another way that I have to mention as a Jungian analyst, equally important way. I've gotten 2 of my spirit animals from big dreams, dreams that I had mostly in my last year or 2 of training in Zurich, which is very much like an initiation experience. So those animals are still with me today. This is like 40 some years after I graduated from the Jung Institute in Zurich.
Mother side or complex. And the question is particularly with for women, in order to develop an intimate relationship, and it always means that we have to have a better relationship with the good mother instead of us, right? And for the women in middle age, and how to explore the relationship to the partner.
The explore the relationship to the partner for a middle-aged woman.
Yeah.
That's the question. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's probably best answered by a middle-aged woman. Uh, let me see here. Yeah, the yeah, at the broadest kind of conceptual framework, boy, you're talking about two different aspects here. One is a system that I particularly like. It's assessing relationships based on two premises: intimacy needs, where humans are social creatures, and autonomy needs. So um, for for a woman to feel her autonomy and her sense as a person would be important to feel the mothering side, or the just the archetypal feminine. Let's leave it at that. Archetypal feminine, uh, uh, which includes the three different stages, right? The maiden, the mother, and the crone. So that leads to the second aspect of it, is depending on what stage you're at, um, your way of being a woman will be different. It is very different from being a maiden to being a mother, from being a crone. And Jung talked about the importance of the phases of life. He was the first psychologist to talk about it in that way. And the Indians, the Hindus have a great sense about the stages of life, including a last stage where you just go out and focus on the spiritual realm and become a beggar and so on. So that's kind of a preliminary take on that question.
Mhm. Sorry, Dennis, the three stages, maiden, mother, and a crone, right?
Right.
The queen, I mean,
Crone. Right. I talked about that in one of the earlier lectures I gave in China. I can't remember which one it was. Um, but it's related as well to such an important concept in the I Ching about the four phases in any cycle of development: spring, growth, harvest, and trial. And
mhm.
you can apply that to a human life cycle. But for the women, the three most prominent ones, again, are maiden, like the virgin stage, the mother stage, and the crone, somebody postmenopausal, if you will. Um, and each of those, of course, each of those have different types of hormones, especially postmenopausal women. So there will be a different bodily base, if you will, that in that psyche-soma connection, that the psyche is going to be in the world in a different way as well.
You know, we raise a very interesting question in China for the women development. In China and nowadays, we have the requirement for a woman. On one hand, she needs to be independent, to have her own business, own profession. And on the other hand, she needs to get married, have children, looking after the family. Yeah. So in terms of this, maybe the story, and is there anything related to um, some storyline in the fairy tale in a symbolic way?
Um, well, remember I said in the first lecture that fairy tales are some of the most pure forms of the archetypes. And the feminine is the idea of the feminine epitomized by the queen, if you will. That image is going to change over time. Um, and in my own lifetime, I was in Berkeley in the late 60s when a lot of these movements started to arise, including feminism. And it's been so interesting to see how women had come together independent of men, kind of like Cinderella being by herself after the family gone to the ball. So women had to get together amongst women and talk about what is it like to be a woman without these men around telling us or influencing us. So getting in touch with the feminine energy what we see in American culture is we have a lot of women, yes, that are professionals and so on, but there's such a huge conflict, and it's really difficult when you have the professional women and then they want to become mothers. And boy, just the challenges of, being a mother and raising kids and so on. And then when you have two professionals, the man and the woman are professionals, and let's say they're both university professors. Those are the kind of modern problems that we have. It was much simpler in a way. In America, I talk about it back in the 50s when men went out and had the job and women were at home. So it's much more complex and difficult, and a lot more intricate negotiations that go on when you have liberated women. And another dilemma of that is now the men are confused about how to relate to these women. So just to go back to some very important concept that I presented at the very beginning, that archetypes are relevant in many different levels. So in regard to the last question as well, that at the personal level, it would be like for a woman to be wrestling and trying to find her place as an individual woman within her culture or family. At the cultural level, it would be like the women, and like those 60s women getting together and trying to get a sense of what the feminine is to be in that culture at that time. And the third dimension that I mentioned this before as well is that in terms of this era, what Jung called the New Age, that a whole paradigm shift in a culture or the cultures worldwide. And one of the aspects of that, Jung thought there would be a rise in the archetypal feminine energy. So those are three levels: personal, like cultural, women of a culture at a point in time, and then the broadest archetypal is archetypal feminine in the age of Aquarius or the New Age.
So a last question about you. It just show us the interpretation of the fairy tale Cinderella, especially from the I Ching perspective. So that is bridge is really curious, and how you relate the fairy tale interpretation and the I Ching, since she felt it's very interesting perspective. What make you bring them together?
Well, I have found it interesting to myself that when I discovered Jung, I felt like I had been looking for it all my life. I just felt like it fit me like a glove. And then when I discovered the I Ching, it was pretty much the same way. Uh, it's like, where has this book been all my life? I didn't find out about it until I was nearly finishing my PhD in entomology at Berkeley. So for me, it's pretty natural to connect Jungian concepts, which is fundamentally how the conceptual system that I work out of, if you will, and the framework. But also, as I mentioned before, it seems like Jung could have written the I Ching, especially the Wilhelm I Ching, and I think it had a tremendous influence on Jung's formulation of his system. So the I Ching is one of my main symbol systems, and quite frankly, it's the one as I mentioned in that lecture that I gave at Orange County, I can't imagine a book that can so easily go to such fundamental levels that, as I imagine it as a Jungian, and given what Jung said, that at its core, it's about the archetypal number. The I Ching at its core is a binary system, and it's the same system that computers run on. So starting from that most archetypal basis, I think these Chinese sages built up this, in the end, what was something that you could put into metaphor and story form. So I'll stop there. Once I get going on the I Ching and Jung, I just have to stop myself.
Hey, Dennis. It's
Thank
late
you,
today.
Coco. I have no idea
Thank
how
you.
you can take those complex ideas and translate them. Thank you so much. 谢谢。
Thank you, thank you。那我们要谢谢大家啊，谢谢大家，同时也谢谢老师哈，那给我们这么多的支持。Thank you so much for your sharing, your generosity. Okay.
And I'll see you all next week for another great installment of Cinderella.
OK，我们期待下一次哈，看到后续的故事。Thank you, Dennis。下周见了，
Okay.
拜
Good
拜。
night or good morning.
Yeah, good night.